Americans For Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans For Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 15th, 2019. For many of us, St. Patrick's Day is associated with people wearing green, shamrocks, green beer, and an excuse to meet our friends and have fun. However, few of the people celebrating his day really know much about the man known as St. Patrick. An article written by Ron Cassie that appeared in the Baltimore Magazine sets out some facts about him. First, St. Patrick did not banish the snakes from Ireland. After the last ice age, snakes just simply never returned to the Emerald Isle. There's no proof that Patrick used the three-leaf shamrock to impart the doctrine of the Trinity to the 5th century pagan Irish. He was born Maewyn in Scotland or Wales, and his family moved to England. When he was 16, he was captured by raiders and sold into slavery in Ireland. He was a slave there for 6 years, then escaped back to England where his family was living. Several decades later, around 433 A.D., he returned to Ireland and worked for 30 years to convert the Irish to the Catholic faith, often putting his life at risk. Now, even though the papacy did not condemn slavery until the end of the 19th century, Patrick was an outspoken critic of slavery, even though it put his life in great danger. Around the time he died, on March 17, 461, Irish slave trading had ended and not resumed. He was never officially canonized by a pope, but acquired the title saint because of his deeds. Now here's our St. Patrick's Day request to President Trump. Now, even though Ireland didn't actually have snakes that crawled on the ground when St. Patrick arrived, some believe that the snakes he drove from Ireland were the Druids and pagans who the Catholic Church considered evil. By converting the Irish to Christianity, St. Patrick minimized the influence of the Druids and their ability to control the Irish citizens. Although President Trump's ancestors were from Germany and Scotland and he never lived in Ireland, he has come to Washington, D.C. and was immediately confronted with the modern-day equivalent of the Druids, the inhabitants of the swamp. Like the Druids, the swamp inhabitants try to weave a spell as to why they're the ones who know what's best for the rest of us and that we should not dare question their directions but follow them explicitly. Like the Druids, the swamp inhabitants have become very convinced that nothing is more important than the perpetuation of their power. They have decided that the way to evaluate any position is to first find out if it benefits them and their friends in Congress. If it does, then they will use all of their powers of persuasion, money, and even warnings and threats to advance the position, even if it does not benefit everyone else. Like the Druids, the swamp inhabitants fear any change that will expose their real purpose of controlling things only for their benefit. They celebrate the discord between the parties because that means that more people on all sides will seek their guidance and pay them enormous amounts of money for it. It will also keep the little people who are not part of the swamp or their friends so distracted that no one will see through the noise and see what's really happening. To quote Abi Winkanabi, "I felt a great disturbance in the force, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced." Now, there are not millions of swamp inhabitants, but there has been a disturbance in the force. First, there was the impossible election of President Trump. All of these swamp-friendly candidates were pushed aside by this upstart who owed none of his success to the swamp. This was frightening, and they ensured that he was quickly educated that the only way to operate in D.C. was to play by their rules. Even though his party had a majority in both houses, he barely got a tax reform proposal passed, and then they refused to allow him to deal with immigration or to fund his wall. In short, they believe that they will be much better served if the upstart is either forced out of office or not reelected. Another disturbing problem for the swamp inhabitants is the election of all the young radicals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These young people don't understand how things should be done, and they have no respect for anyone who doesn't agree with them. The swamp inhabitants will use the fear of radical change engendered by AOC's group to secure large fees. They don't mind when somebody scares people and causes a flood of money to their coffers, but they are concerned that members like AOC may actually mean to make those changes and not be willing to be advised by the swamp inhabitants. In conclusion, the swamp inhabitants don't really like change. They have a good thing going and they don't want to see that change. If you went to D.C. and labored as a congressional staffer until you could get a well-paying job as a full-time member of the swamp, these developments are unsettling. It isn't hard to understand. If suddenly all the work done by lawyers was in real threat of being eliminated, I, as a lawyer, would be worried. I mean, what else could I do to produce income for my family? Now, most people might say to the longtime congressional staffer who wants to trade his time making the laws harder to understand for a higher paying position, and to the lawyers who were put out of work, good riddance. However, it does explain why many lobbyists are so indignant when someone asks them how they manage to sleep at night. They've put up screens that shelter them from seeing that the only people who benefit from their activities are them and their friends. In truth, the ex-staffers and lobbyists can probably get real and productive jobs, just as could the displaced lawyers. They just don't want to do it. President Trump, please drain the swamp and be like St. Patrick. Drive the snakes, the swamp creatures, out of D.C. The best way to start? Pass the fair tax. It will remove a huge amount of money from the hands of lobbyists and be a lot better for the rest of us.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans For Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org or bigsolution.org.